Sisters and brothers, welcome to African Genius, the Pan-African podcast, promoting Pan-African culture, thought, and art, cultivating a universal African mind. I am your co-host, UncleAsar Alekebulan.
Greetings, everybody. This is Wesley Pepper, the co-host. This is episode 9 of the African Genius Podcast. Remember, guys, to smash that like and subscribe button and help this podcast grow. It has been growing. I just told UncleAsar just offline. We actually got picked up by a streaming platform called Mediocre. I still don't know how to pronounce the name, but that's always a good thing. The different platforms pick it up. So much love to that. If you're first time listening to this for this podcast, smash that like and subscribe button, man. Yeah, it always helps. And we have a second time guest, Dr. Max Hilaire. He's actually, just before we get into everything, your episode is actually the most popular episode we had so far. And I created some Facebook shorts, so like 1 minute videos on a few, I think 3. And I actually got some, not backlash, but there was some people trying to pick a fight with me on YouTube. So I thought that was a step in the right direction. So thank you for that. So, I mean, I didn't engage in anything because I don't argue with fucking bots or whatever. But I just wanted to mention that was, it seemed like, you're always on the right path. If you say certain things and you strike a chord with somebody remotely, wherever, okay. So thank you for that, Dr. Max.
Yeah.
So welcome back, Doc.
Thank you very much.
Always. And I know you've been on sabbatical, traveling far and wide, and I hope you're rested. And we're going to get right into it. On our last recording with Brother Ansar, we actually talked about leadership, not only on the continent, but throughout the diaspora, particularly in the U.S., where our political leaders are unwilling to relinquish power and de facto ineffective in most instances. And I know that you're working on a piece about dictatorship, and
Yes.
I wanted to get your perspective before we move forward to what's going on the continent around Niger and Zimbabwe and South Africa and places like that.
So you want me to give you my take on the creeping dictatorial tendencies in the U.S.? Is that
in the U.S. and Africa, both? Yeah.
okay? Well, I think there is, of course, we see a political organization that has adopted very much from the dictatorial playbooks of the Putins and Orban in Hungary and others. I think what's going for the US that you don't have elsewhere is, one, you have a democratic tradition, you have constitutional norms that have endured for 200 plus years, and the system here, as opposed to elsewhere where you have checks and balances, so you have 3 branches, even though 2 of the branches, or 1.5, the Supreme Court and the House of Representatives, are all corrupt. So it's difficult to say whether these guys would enforce the democratic norms that have been put in place over 200 years. But I think what we see with Trump and the Republicans is the fragility of the American democratic system. And it is not difficult to see a scenario where, unless, if Trump gets in or something happens where, there's chaos, we could see the military or the National Guards brought in. So we are facing a period of uncertainty in the US going into 2024. And there's the rest of the world is looking at us and saying, well, if it can happen in America, then why not in, other places, right? And then it diminishes our moral authority to lecture other countries about restoring democracy and the rule of law when we are in political chaos and are not respecting the norms that have been established for the United States for over 200 years. Mm-hmm. So perception matters, and how people view the United States coming 2024 is going to have a huge impact on our foreign policy and going forward into 2025. So I'm afraid we've seen a diminishing of American credibility abroad because of what happened in 2021. And hence, if the chaos continues, no consensus, which has always been the strength of the U.S. in foreign policy, a bipartisan consensus, if that is eroding, then the U.S. has no credibility around the world. It is difficult for even Biden to restore some of the damage or to eradicate some of the damage Trump caused while he was in office. I mean, it's semi-paralyzed the Biden administration, whether it's in trade or in other human rights or whatever. And consequently, we find ourselves in a position where, you know, there was already a lack of global leadership. And because of the chaos in the US, we are unable to provide that leadership. And there's no one else except, you see, China and Russia stepping in. But who wants to be like China and Russia? I mean, that's not the leadership we are looking for. We are looking for leadership that respects human rights, the rule of law, and the ability of people to live a decent life and opportunities for their families. And these regimes are not able to provide that. So,
and on the same note, let's talk specifically about Black leadership in America. Then we'll move to the continent. You know, we're the only group of people who recognize celebrities and comedians and you know, actors and such as leaders. And even the Congressional Black Caucus, I feel is ineffective. We had a president who looked like us, virtually ineffective, and you can give some specifics on that. But you know, what's your perspective on all of that?
I think the Congressional Black Caucus doesn't really have I don't know what's their agenda, frankly. And second of all, I think they're in it for themselves. There are too many old people in the Black congressional delegation, people who share the same tendency as some of the leaders in Africa. Mm-hmm. So, like in Africa, in the United States, demographics for African Americans is almost the same as Africa. There's about 60% African Americans who are under 25. But when you look at the leadership of, you know, the Black leadership in the United States, most of these people are in their 60s, 70s and older. So there's a disconnect between the needs and the concerns of young people and the ability of these folks who are so entrenched in the system to deliver to them. And there's no movement to groom a young Black leadership to assume office when these people die. Because apparently they're not retiring. Most of them seems like they want to die in office. Mm-hmm. Or if they were to leave the Congress, then they assume some other political leadership. So we see Dana Bash as the mayor of Los Angeles after spending years in Congress. And I think Sheila Jackson Lee is likely to be the mayor of Houston once she leaves Congress. So what does that say in terms of an up-and-coming Black leadership? It's not there, and we see the same trend in Africa. The Caribbean is no different either.
Mm-hmm. So let's move into, if you will, to the African continent. There's a coup in Niger. ECOWAS is threatening military action. AFRICOM is there. The French are there. Tell us what's happening.
Well, I think the coup in Niger was, it's somewhat of a symptom that is plaguing the continent. So we've had 3 coups in 2 years, right? In Mali, Burkina Faso, now Niger, right? ECOWAS initially, a few years ago, were able to intervene in the Gambia to restore democracy, right? So they also did the same in Sierra Leone, had somewhat of a say in Liberia. But when you look at the leadership of ECOWAS, right, we just had an election in Nigeria that was tainted and mad in corruption and irregularities. And again, Tinubu does not really have the legitimacy that one would have assumed that a leader of Nigeria would command. So the fact that Tinubu himself just came into office, he has not been able to even put his cabinet together. And even if he were in office for a year, he's not wrest control of the insecurity, the kidnapping, the political chaos, and the economic decay in Nigeria. So how do you abandon that unless you just want to shift attention away from your own problems in Nigeria? But what you find is there's no domestic consensus for military intervention in Niger. So most Nigerians are saying, well, your priority should be restoring security in Nigeria. And of course, your own legitimacy is on the line because for the most part, Nigerians do not believe Tinubu was genuinely, freely and fairly elected president. So given that situation, and then the reluctance on some of the other members of ECOWAS to intervene, nor do they have the capabilities to do so unless Nigeria goes along, because Nigeria has the largest army. So a lack of consensus in Nigeria, the reluctance on the part of some other members of ECOWAS to intervene, and the uncertainty, because a lot of people more than likely will get killed if there's a military intervention in Niger, because it will be resisted. So again, there's a pause. They're trying to work out some diplomatic outcome, and it might be the best thing, but I don't think you're going to reverse the coup trend in Africa, because there's a disconnect again between these leaders who found themselves in office through illegitimate means, and then the needs of the majority population that is under 25. Now, they were the young people in Niger and Burkina Faso, Mali, they've all been in Russian flags. They're all anti-French or anti-West. But I don't think it solves the deep underlying problems of any of these countries, nor does it bring immediate economic gains to the young people in those countries. So I think we're in a state of paralysis for a long time to come, because part of the problems in Africa is external, but also part of it is internal, whether it has to do with poor leadership, it has to do with corruption, it has to do with greed, and it doesn't create a path for young people to be able to enter the political process and to have a say in the governance of their countries.
Yeah, everybody, we're back. So we'll just hit it. We'll just take it up from where we left. Dr. Max, you were explaining, we're getting into the fact that these new, let me just call it a movement, these new governments that are coming in, especially on the continent, with all these ideas and so forth, but they're not tackling the fundamental, the grassroots problems that actually put us in this position. And South Africa is also a very good example. Like, in '94, they said, black people this, and we're going to get out of poverty and all of, we're going to have a black government and all of that. And nothing has really changed, and nothing is more prudent than the current electricity problem, because the government came in and they filled their pockets. They dangle this almost this carrot in front of the cart type of scenario in front of black people, say, keep us in power, everything will get better, everything will get better. But the truth is, almost 30 odd years since democracy. And if you just look at the infrastructure and the main things like roads, electricity and so forth has gotten much worse. So we were talking about West Africa, so we can just pick it up from there.
Yeah, and I mean, again, the expectations were very high when majority rule came to South Africa, right? But I think part of it was people having been under white minority oppression for so long, and the misconception about politics and the ability of government to deliver, whether it's in the United States or it's in Europe or on the continent. I think the role of government has severely diminished and eroded because, number one, governments do not have the revenues they once had because they've given a lot of tax breaks and relief to corporations. And hence, governments simply do not have the resources to invest in in the needs of people. I mean, we knew the problems of South Africa were so huge that an ANC government would not have been able to deliver, whether it's housing or redistribution of farmlands or compensate people for years of oppression or even victims who were killed by law enforcement in South Africa, so their families never receive any form of compensation for it, right? So the fact that people were, their expectations were tampered a bit because they knew the ANC, yes, they have political power, but economic power is still in the hands of whites. Mm-hmm. And unless you had some serious economic reform in South Africa, you were not going to have a redistribution of the wealth of the country. South Africa is not a poor country, but we know the wealth of the country is in the hands of a few. And then the ANC has been sucked into that elitist, the corporate wealth, those who control the wealth of the country, and basically became corrupt. So yes, the only way out may very well be a revolution in South Africa, which I would not dismiss, because at some point the people in Soweto, particularly the young people who stood up against white oppression, are gonna get fed up of seeing what the ANC has done and the level of corruption, and then revolt against them, right? I would not be surprised, because after 30 years in power, people are still living in the same conditions in Soweto and in the other townships. And people are asking, well, is it ever going to get better? How long can we wait, right? And the young people who were born after apartheid, they came up in a period when they expect a better life for themselves. And even some of them have children now, and they're not seeing any improvement. So I think they're going to wait and see the outcome of the next election in South Africa, which I would hope will send a message to the ANC, because I don't expect the ANC is going to win an outright majority in the elections, but it may very well be a wake-up call for them, that people, the majority population, are fed up of what they're seeing and their inability to do something to improve themselves, their lives. So I'm afraid my hope is that it doesn't get like Zimbabwe, but it is not far-fetched that South Africa could go the Zimbabwe route.
How do you characterize Zimbabwe in that sense?
Well, you have economic stagnation. You have a corrupt regime. The ZANU-PF has been in power since independence. I mean, initially things started out rightly, but in the last 20 years, with Mugabe's rule and then taken over by Emerson Mnangagwa, nothing has really changed. the sanctions that were imposed on Zimbabwe has not been lifted because we've not seen an improvement in whether it's governance or economic reform in Zimbabwe. The level of corruption is still the same, and you have a regime that is very autocratic. So the people in Zimbabwe were expecting Mnangagwa to show some improvement, and he's worse than Mugabe.
Yeah. Dr. Max, let me get your opinion on this. You know what's happening in Burkina Faso. I forgot the leader's name, but the guy with the military garb. As soon as it actually became a meme on social media when he said something to the effect that Burkina Faso doesn't need France's anything from France, and they kicked them out. They stopped selling uranium to them and so forth. Social media was very quick to call him the new Thomas Sankara. And there was actually physical, tall, dark and handsome and everything, all of that. And he spoke the right way. My take is I'm very skeptical of any military leadership ruling any government. I don't think they are trained to be diplomatic, and the fact that he's always in with the boots and he looks like he can just pop out. He looks like he can be violent. What's your take on that?
Well, I agree with you. I don't believe the military should be able to assume power just because they have the military might to do so, right? And we've seen, I lived in Nigeria during 2 military regimes, and I didn't see any improvement from, in fact, the second military regime was more repressive and more brutal than the first one, right? The economic conditions for people didn't improve. It's yet to improve even after the restoration of civilian rule, right? So the military does so much damage. Even when the civilians come in, it makes it almost impossible for them to be able to reform, whether it's the economic or political system that the military created. So in Burkina Faso, for example, which is a relatively poor country, yes, Burkina Faso has gold and some other mineral resources, but it's a relatively poor country, less in comparison to Nigeria or South Africa or even Ghana, right? And yes, Sankara was a charismatic leader. He came to power through a coup, and the French, who had very strong control in that region at the time, orchestrated his demise. They killed him, right? Yeah. I met Sankara in New York when he first came to speak at the United Nations. So, I mean, I had great hopes that this guy, as he said, they did not need foreign assistance. They wanted the equipment, the tools, the instruments to be self-sufficient, right? But the people who took over, whether it's Blaise Compaoré and then the people after him, they have not done much. I mean, I don't expect them to do much. And then you have a growing insurgency in Burkina Faso, in Mali, in Niger, that the militaries, and of course, Boko Haram in Nigeria and in Cameroon, Chad, the militaries cannot respond. I mean, Nigeria has the biggest, the most brutal army, and they are yet to put down, in 8 years, they were not able to, or more than 8 years, to control Boko Haram, right? Because one, I think there are people within the Nigerian military, particularly in the intelligence services, that are working alongside with Boko Haram. And they're profiting from the activities of these guys, right? So in Burkina Faso, the military took power, claiming that the insecurity forced them to do so because the French and the previous government were not able to create a secure environment for people. but nothing has improved. The rebels are still attacking people right into the capital, Ouagadougou. So, yes, the military took over, whether there or in Mali, but the security situation has not improved. They have both invited the Wagner group to come in to assist, but we know the reputation of the Wagner group. I mean, one, they commit serious human rights abuse, and two, they're just there to exploit the resources of the countries. So I don't believe, and of course there is uncertainty about the future of the Wagner group in Africa. We may see some other paramilitary Russian GRU-backed Russian private security contractors replacing Wagner. But I do not believe that these paramilitary groups coming into shore up, whether it's the government or quote unquote bring security to these countries, are going to be successful.
So the people are languishing, right? But you have these groups like Wagner coming in, taking the resources. You have other groups coming, the Chinese they're doing some things, but they're there for a reason, resources. France and the Western powers for all the minerals in Burkina Faso, Niger, what we're talking about. But the people still languish.
Yes.
And underlying all of this, again, is bad leadership. Poor leadership, bad leadership is what we call it. And they are getting richer and richer. I mean, we talked about Thomas Sankara and the things he did for Burkina Faso. And then when he was murdered, Compaoré turned it all back around. Right?
Yeah.
So they're no longer self-sufficient in that sense. Talk to us about the enthusiasm. I was going to say willingness, but I won't say enthusiasm for African leaders to sell out their people, to sell out the country for economic gain and riches.
Well, we've seen it for a very long time that many of the hopes we had for some leaders faded very quickly, right? So whereas some of these leaders come in with a lot of high expectations and goodwill that they want to improve the economic or social environments of their countries, quickly morph into being as corrupt as the people they replace, right? So I'm not sure I would pin my hopes on any one of these leaders. In fact, I don't see any leader in Africa I could pin my hope on at this time, right? Because we need governance reform in Africa. We also need people who are capable of negotiating these commercial agreements, particularly in countries where there are huge deposits of mineral resources. Right? So you need to be able to negotiate good agreements that is going to deliver the revenues from the export of whether it's gold, it's coltan, it's diamonds, it's uranium, whatever, that some of that money is going to go into improving the living standards of people. And, people are not asking for much. To build good roads, to build public health centers, to build public schools, because everyone realizes the only hopes for their kids to improve their lives is to get an education. And if they can't get not even a high school education, what's the expectation? So you look at places like DRC, where the choice between going to school and going to work in a mine, right? In a copper mine, run by the Chinese or run by Western companies, right? It's against international labor laws. But what are the choices for these children? And the same, what are the choices for those who engage in military activities or those who engage in child prostitution? I mean, it's basic, the options given to, the choices given to these children are not very attractive.
That's quite
so you become a child soldier, or you become a child.
Dr. Max?
A blind eye to what's going on with their own citizens.
Mm-hmm. Wesley, did you have something?
Yeah, I just want to say that's quite a somber point. When you're highlighting like these kids don't have much of a choice. It actually leads me sort of to my next question, and I want to use South Africa as another example. So sure, with our elections coming up next year, the ANC, a lot of people are forecasting them to lose at least 50% majority in most of the major cities, Johannesburg, Cape Town, and so forth. And I can totally see that. We already lost a chunk in the local elections 2 years ago. But the EFF, Julius Malema, is a young fella. Okay, he's touching 40 or just over 40. I think he's worse. When you're saying that, giving children or not having much of a choice, he seems to be the only beacon of light, because he trends on, so they really know how to work social media. They always say these profound things on social media, and these clips go viral. It gets picked up by media houses all over the continent, and I follow this. And they're always like, like good this and what's your take on do you think that this new generation, the younger generation, so the 40-year-olds, my generation, and so forth, do you think it's just another chip of the old block? Just that these guys are just smarter and they just know how to work social media? Because if you look at it, if you look at the detail, there's the stuff that they're saying, and then these other, in our case, the ANC is saying, there's not much difference.
I mean, you were right. I mean, I'm not sure. Again, I have had the experience of working with highly educated people from Africa who studied in the West, returned to Africa, and the way they behave, you would never think they ever left Africa, right? I mean, frankly, yes, on one hand, they pretend to be elitists, but on the other hand, there's no difference in the way they act vis-a-vis the poor, the underclass, as opposed to those who, the elites who were born into wealth and privilege, who stayed in their home countries and treated even their immediate family members who were less fortunate, the children of family members who were less fortunate, treat them as bad as they would treat strangers. So personally, I don't have much hopes. I would say, show me. If you show me what you can do, then maybe. But I think what we need to do, like in South Africa, at least it's a two-term presidency, so there's some hope. Ghana has the same. Nigeria has the same, a two-term presidency, and then you're out. At least it gives people the hopes, even though, yeah, you have an election, but the fact that the election is the outcome is predetermined, then you say to yourself, as a new candidate, so let's say you were a new candidate running for parliament or running for the presidency, what's your likelihood of winning? I mean, the chances are not very good. All the obstacles up against you. You don't have access to the press. They suppress your rallies and political gatherings, right? They find ways to stifle any kind. They either don't deliver enough ballots to districts where they know they're unpopular and the opposition is very strong. Which is what we saw in Zimbabwe. The same happened in Nigeria, right? So, you delay the delivering ballots to districts where you know you're weak, or you put up all kinds of roadblocks that make it impossible for people to get to vote. I mean, we saw the same in the United States in 2020, where they made it very difficult for African Americans to get to vote in places like Texas, in Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, anywhere you have a heavy concentration of African Americans, they had all kinds of shenanigans that either to frustrate you or to outrightly make it impossible for you to vote. So, we are seeing the same thing happening in some of these countries, and they're just looking at what's going on in Western democracies and, just borrowing from that to perfect their skills of running unfair and unfree elections that would guarantee their stay in power. So I don't know. It's a hopeless case. I hate to be so hopeless or so pessimistic about the future of the continent. But, there's a sliver of optimism in me, because if you are not optimistic, then it's pointless.
Yeah, then you might as well just give up.
Right? So
in speaking about that optimism, I was talking to a brother. He's a pan-Africanist at the university where I work just the other day, and he said he's a Nigerian of Nigerian descent, although he was raised in this country. And he said that the hope of Africa, of the continent, lies in the, and I use this term, African American. And the reasons he gave, and I hope I'm presenting his position fairly. He said because we are pretty much the most educated and the wealthiest in America. And then I pointed out that also people like Nkrumah and some of those people you mentioned, they were educated in the West. And out of the freedom movements in the West, Africa was decolonized. So what is your perspective on that, Doc?
Well, I would think, if, as you're saying, right, and it's not just African Americans, you have wealthy Black people throughout the diaspora, right? But with the AU or individual governments, with the exception of Ghana, have not made it easy to facilitate whether investment or tourism or any kind of input from the diaspora in the development of Africa. So Ghana took the lead and say, well, anyone from the diaspora who wants to return, especially those who can contribute to Ghana's development, can return, right? But none of these other countries make it extremely difficult for us. And some of them are outright hostile because, I mean, they just don't see us as part of them. I mean, you look at the situation in Haiti, right? Haiti was the first independent Black republic, right? Besides Ethiopia, right? So Haiti was the first. And it was 154 years after Haitian independence that the first sub-Saharan African country gained its independence, Ghana, right? Haiti is plagued by gang violence right now. And with the exception of Kenya, that has agreed to send 1,000 law enforcement to help with the situation there, not one African country has said, well, we are willing to help Haiti, which should be seen as an African country.
Absolutely.
The entire Caribbean should be seen as, African countries. Mm-hmm. We don't have observer status. We don't have membership in the AU. And they treat us like we are completely, just disconnected from them. In fact, when I travel in Africa, I'm surprised. The first question I hear from children when I go to the schools is, how comes you are not from Malawi or you are not from Angola and you are Black?
They don't, they're not talking about
I get it all the time. Mm-hmm. And I go to the schools to give out supplies because I travel with school supplies to give to the children. Mm-hmm. And I ask the embassy to arrange for me to go to a school and talk with the children. And I always get that question, no matter what country I go to, is how comes I'm Black and I'm not from their country? Mm-hmm. And then I have to tell them, give them a little history of how we are in the diaspora as a result of slavery, which goes back 300-400 years, and we ended up in the Caribbean or in the United States or in South America.
Now, I challenge anyone to approach a child in a synagogue, and they would not be able to tell you about their history. But we, on the African continent, even in this country, we don't get it. We don't understand. Go ahead, Wes.
I second.
Well, again, they're not teaching. They don't want people to know. Well, if you look at Florida, I mean, the new textbook wants to sort of glorify slavery. I mean, I don't know. It's no matter what they do, they cannot erase that injustice from our legacy or the history of the world, right? So we are still living that legacy, whether in the US or in the Caribbean or in Europe. So it's not going to go away, the injustice committed against African people. Mm-hmm. But the African leaders themselves and Caribbean leaders need to live up to this and take a position which yes, some of them did participate and got rich in the slave trade. But they need to live up to the fact that they committed atrocities against us.
What do you think about the guy in Guyana and Jamaica who is apologizing for enslavement? His family, Gladstone or something like that?
Is that a white man?
Yeah, so his family is apologizing.
Yeah, there are a couple of these British families that have gone back to the Caribbean and apologize and set up funds to somewhat pay reparations. But the British government and the monarchy need to accept their participation and how they got rich through colonialism and slavery, which they were the kingmakers. They were the ones who initiated slavery and colonialism, and in part responsible for some of the chaos that we are seeing in Africa. Mm-hmm. Because they came in and divided up Africa without taking into account the ethnic divide or the religious issues, the political traditions people had on the continent, and basically imposed something totally foreign on Africa and expect it to work. It will never work. It has not worked and it will never work because people had their own form of organizations that were very advanced. I mean, how do you just erase Timbuktu as one of the most advanced cities with the best universities on the planet? How do you erase, Musa Mansa was the richest man on the planet.
Actually, I read somewhere Hollywood is trying to make a movie about him, a biopic about Mansa Musa. They were trying to get money for it or somewhere. So there's some information. But Dr. Max, I wanted to ask, things are looking pretty bleak. But I'd like to sort of end up with, close with something a bit more optimistic about for the black child. I know that we're living in a technical technology. I was just saying, technology has really brought us together. I love what you're saying about how the entire diaspora should sort of come together, as opposed to because that's very evident here in South Africa, across the continent actually. If you are an American or British accent, you're still black, but you're not us. You're not part of us. Almost as if being poor is what in Africa you must be poor. Bare feet, dusty streets, kicking a fucking ball. Like if you don't have that, then you're not part of it. I think that is ludicrous.